My brother's wife threatened to call the police on my father for cleaning his own property. So I used 8 years of their manipulation to expose their inheritance scheme and cost them everything. At 36, I thought I understood my family. We weren't perfect. Dad was stubborn, scarred by losing his own father at age 1, and Mom was the eternal peacekeeper trying to hold us all together. But we were solid. My wife Sarah and I lived in the house Dad helped us buy, drove the car he co-signed for, and raised our 2 boys with the kind of stability I'd always craved growing up. My relationship with my older brother Marcus had always been complicated. We weren't close, but he was still my brother. When he got married 10 years ago, I was genuinely happy for him. His wife Sarah seemed nice enough, quiet, polite, the kind of woman who smiled a lot but never said much of substance. Dad was 59 then, carrying decades of depression and abandonment issues like invisible scars. Mom was 58, still beautiful, still trying to fix everyone's problems. We were a typical family with typical dysfunction, nothing that couldn't be managed with patience and understanding. Or so I thought. Sarah, my sister-in-law, was the kind of person who presented herself as reasonable while making unreasonable demands. She had perfected the art of playing the victim while orchestrating the drama. I should have seen it earlier, but she was subtle about it. The first red flag came during family dinners. She'd make little comments about Dad's old-fashioned ways, or how overwhelming our family gatherings were for her. She'd smile sweetly while suggesting that maybe we didn't need to get together so often, that maybe Marcus needed more space to focus on his own family. But it was the way she looked at things, our parents' house, Dad's classic car collection, the land they owned, that should have warned me. Her eyes would linger, calculating. She'd ask casual questions about values, about Dad's plans for retirement, about what would happen if something happened to your parents. I dismissed it as natural curiosity. Everyone wonders about inheritance, right? When Marcus and Sarah decided they needed their first home, our parents made what seemed like the perfect gesture. They were empty nesters in a 4-bedroom house with acres of land, and Marcus needed a place to start his married life. The house was appraised at $210,000, but Dad lowered the price to $140,000. A $70,000 wedding gift to help his eldest son get established. It was generous, loving, and exactly the kind of thing Dad would do for his children. "I can't believe your parents are doing this for us," Sarah had said, tears in her eyes as she hugged Dad after the closing. "This means everything." For 2 years, everything seemed perfect. Marcus and Sarah hosted family dinners, Mom helped Sarah learn to garden, and Dad would stop by to help with maintenance projects. It felt like family the way it was supposed to be. Then came the conversation that changed everything. "The house never feels like mine," Marcus told us one Sunday afternoon. "I think we want to sell and find our own place." We understood completely. It was Dad's house for 30 years. Of course it would take time to feel like home. No one was upset. Dad even offered to help them find a new place. But what came next exposed Sarah's true nature. Dad had accumulated decades worth of classic cars, farming equipment, and tools on the property. When Marcus decided to sell, Dad needed to clear everything out. He threw himself into the project with typical intensity, spending every day for weeks moving, sorting, and hauling away 30 years of accumulated possessions. Every morning, he'd tell Marcus, "I'll be back tomorrow to work on the barn." It became routine, predictable. Dad had keys to the property, his property until recently, and he was methodical about cleaning up his mess. I remember driving by one afternoon and seeing Dad in coveralls, sweat streaming down his face as he loaded another truck with old car parts. He was 59 years old, working like a man half his age to make sure his son got a clean property to sell. "He's really going above and beyond," I told my wife that night. "Marcus is lucky to have a dad who cares that much." I had no idea that Dad's dedication was about to become a weapon against him. The explosion came on a Tuesday afternoon in late spring. I got the phone call from Mom 20 minutes after it happened, her voice shaking with shock and anger. Dad had arrived at the property as usual, using his key to unlock the gate and head to the barn where he'd been sorting through old equipment. It was 2 p.m. on a weekday, the same time he'd been coming for weeks. But that day, Sarah burst out of the house like her hair was on fire. "You need to tell us when you're coming over," she screamed, her face flushed with embarrassment and rage. "I walk around naked when I'm home alone. If you come over unannounced again, I'm calling the police." Dad stood there, covered in grease and sweat from working on her behalf, and processed what he'd just heard. His daughter-in-law, the woman whose mortgage he'd subsidized by $70,000, was threatening to have him arrested for coming to clean up his own property. What happened next was inevitable. Dad, a man who'd never been disrespected in such a fundamental way, let loose with language that would make a sailor blush. He called Sarah every name in the book, with special emphasis on words that started with C and B. "You ungrateful little." The rest was lost in a string of profanity that I won't repeat, but it was creative, thorough, and delivered at full volume. Sarah ran back into the house, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled. Dad finished loading his truck and drove home in silence. That night, Marcus called our mother, his voice shaking with fury. "Dad had no right to call Sarah those names," he said. "But Sarah shouldn't have screamed at him either. He's being an asshole for just showing up like that, but this whole thing is ridiculous." Those were the last words my father ever heard from his eldest son. From that day forward, whenever Marcus brought his family to visit Mom, Dad would disappear into the bedroom, sit facing the wall, and refuse to acknowledge that his son or grandchildren existed. The war had begun, and I didn't even know I was about to become a casualty. What should have been a simple apology and a request for advance notice became something much darker. Marcus didn't just stop talking to Dad, he weaponized the grandchildren. 8-year-old Emma and 6-year-old Tyler became pawns in their parents' war. During family visits, they'd run to show Grandpa their drawings, only to have him turn away without a word. They'd ask Grandma, "Why doesn't Grandpa like us anymore?" And Mom would have to make excuses for behavior she couldn't explain herself. The cruelest part was that Dad was destroying himself over it. I'd catch him staring at photos of the grandkids, his eyes wet with tears he'd never let anyone see. But his pride, damaged by a lifetime of abandonment starting with his father's suicide, wouldn't let him bend. Marcus, meanwhile, seemed content to let the silence stretch indefinitely. When Mom would beg him to call Dad, he'd shrug and say, "He's the one who needs to apologize. I'm not making the first move." But Sarah's behavior during family gatherings became increasingly telling. She'd watch Dad carefully when she talked, gauging his reactions. She'd make pointed comments about healing and forgiveness, while never actually suggesting any concrete steps toward reconciliation. For years into Marcus's exile, I learned firsthand what Dad's wrath looked like. The details of our fight are less important than the result. For years of complete silence between me and my father. For years of my children asking why Grandpa wouldn't talk to Daddy. For years of wondering if I'd permanently destroyed the most important relationship in my life. During those 4 years, I begged Marcus for help. "Could you call Dad? Maybe put in a good word for me? Help me figure out how to fix this." His response was cold and absolute. "You're on your own. You made this mess, you fix it." So I did. I swallowed my pride, admitted fault I wasn't sure I bore, and slowly rebuilt a relationship with my father. It took years of careful conversations, small gestures, and genuine remorse to earn my way back into his good graces. But the experience taught me something crucial about my family. When you fell from Dad's favor, you fell alone. The first ally came from an unexpected source, Mom herself. During my reconciliation with Dad, she'd become my confidant and advisor. She understood Dad's emotional landscape better than anyone, and she helped me navigate the treacherous path back to his affections. "Your father loves deeply and hurts deeply," she'd explained during one of our strategy sessions. "When he feels betrayed, it's like his father dying all over again. The abandonment becomes total." Mom had also been watching Sarah's behavior during family gatherings with increasing suspicion. "She asks a lot of questions about your father's plans," Mom told me one evening. "About his health, about his financial situation. It feels calculating." The second ally was unexpected. My own experience with exile. Having fought my way back from Dad's bad side, I understood the family dynamics in a way that Marcus, who'd never been cut off before, couldn't appreciate. I knew exactly how stubborn Dad could be, and exactly how much patience it would take to restore any relationship with him. The third ally was time itself. 8 years of silence had created patterns, habits, and resentments that would be almost impossible to overcome with simple apologies. Marcus and Sarah had waited too long, let the wound fester too deeply. But it wasn't until Grandma's final crisis that I realized I might need these allies for something much more serious than family mediation. My 93-year-old grandmother had been the heart of our family for decades. When the call came at 2 a.m. that we needed to rush to the assisted living facility, I knew we were facing the end of an era. Mom and I made the hour-and-a-half drive in record time, my heart pounding as I called Marcus repeatedly. No answer. For 2 hours, I dialed their number while Mom sat with Grandma, who was fading fast. Finally, they answered. They lived 1 mile from the facility. 1 mile, but claimed they'd been asleep and hadn't heard the phone. When they arrived, Marcus seemed genuinely upset about Grandma's condition. We spent those precious hours together as a family, and for a moment, it felt like the old wounds might finally heal. Grandma passed the next day, and we buried the woman who'd been our family's emotional anchor for nearly a century. But as we stood outside the funeral home after the service, Marcus made a statement that revealed his true priorities. "You and Mom need to talk to Dad and get him over this BS. It's time for him to be a grandfather to my kids." The audacity stole my breath. After 8 years of silence, after refusing to help during my own exile, he wanted me to negotiate his reconciliation. But something in his tone, demanding rather than pleading, made me suspect there was more to his sudden urgency than concern for his children. That's when Mom provided the intelligence that changed everything. 3 days after Grandma's funeral, Mom was going through the old woman's belongings when she found Dad's estate planning documents mixed in with family photos. What she discovered made her hands shake as she read. Dad's will was crystal clear. Everything, the house, the classic car collection worth more than most people's retirement accounts, the land, the savings, all of it came to me. Marcus got exactly $10. "He wrote this right after the fight with Marcus," Mom whispered, her voice barely audible. "He never changed it back." The weight of it hit me like a physical blow. We were talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars in assets. A lifetime of Dad's work, his passion projects, his security. And Marcus had no idea he'd been written out of it. But Mom had noticed something else that made the pieces click into place. "Sarah's been pushing harder for reconciliation lately, hasn't she?" she asked. "All those comments about being ready to move past things and how the kids need their grandfather?" That's when I realized this wasn't about healing the family at all. Somehow they'd found out about the inheritance, or at least suspected. And now they were maneuvering for position, using me as their unwitting weapon to soften up Dad before they made their move. I felt sick. Not just because of the money, but because of what this meant about my brother's motives. Every conversation about reconciliation, every mention of the grandchildren, every guilt trip about Dad's stubbornness. All of it had been calculated manipulation. Mom and I spent weeks planning our response. We decided to document everything. Every phone call, every text message, every manipulation attempt. If Marcus and Sarah wanted to play games with Dad's legacy, we'd make sure we had evidence of their true motives. The first test came when Sarah called me directly, something that almost never happened. "Jake, I've been thinking a lot about family lately," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "About how short life is. I really think it's time to heal this rift between Marcus and your dad. What do you think? I kept my voice neutral, while my phone recorded every word. What exactly are you proposing, Sarah? Maybe you could talk to your dad? Soften him up a little? Help him understand that Marcus just wants his kids to know their grandfather. There it was, the manipulation wrapped in concern for the children. But the phrase, soften him up, was particularly telling. You don't soften up someone you want to reconcile with. You soften up someone you want to extract something from. I played along, promising to think about it, while documenting every detail of our conversation. Over the next 3 months, the calls became more frequent, more urgent. Sarah would text me articles about the importance of grandparents, share Facebook posts about family forgiveness, even suggest that maybe Dad needed therapy to work through his anger issues. Meanwhile, Marcus himself remained strategically silent, letting his wife do the dirty work while maintaining plausible deniability. The breakthrough came at Christmas dinner. Sarah had been particularly aggressive about reconciliation talk, and Marcus had finally joined in, making his demands more explicit. This has gone on long enough, Marcus announced to the entire family. Dad's being ridiculous. 8 years is enough. Jake, you need to fix this. But then Sarah made a crucial mistake. She cornered Mom in the kitchen and asked point-blank, has Jake talked to his father yet about fixing things with Marcus? When Mom said no, Sarah's mask slipped for just a second. Well, maybe Jake needs to understand what's at stake here. For everyone. Mom had her phone recording the entire conversation. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. And now we had proof. Sarah had essentially admitted that this wasn't about healing the family. It was about securing a financial stake. She'd revealed that she knew there were stakes involved, and that I needed to understand my role in protecting those stakes. But the most damning evidence came from an unexpected source, Marcus himself. 2 weeks after Christmas, Marcus called me directly for the first time in months. He was frustrated, almost angry, and that frustration made him careless with his words. Look, Jake, I need you to understand something, he said, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. Dad's not getting any younger. We need to fix this situation before it's too late to fix anything. What do you mean, too late? I asked, already knowing the answer. I mean, what happens when Dad dies and we're still not talking? What happens to everything he's worked for? It all just goes to you. There it was. The admission I'd been waiting for. Marcus wasn't concerned about his children's relationship with their grandfather. He was concerned about his children's inheritance from their grandfather. Are you asking me about Dad's will, Marcus? The silence that followed was deafening. When he finally spoke, his voice was defensive, almost guilty. I'm not asking about anything specific. I'm just saying that this family rift affects everyone, not just Dad and me. There are broader consequences to consider. I had him, and I had it all on recording. Armed with months of recorded evidence, I waited for the perfect moment to spring the trap. It came at Easter dinner, when Sarah had been particularly aggressive about reconciliation and Marcus had made his demands more explicit than ever before. Dad's being ridiculous, Marcus announced to the entire family gathered at Mom's house. 8 years is enough. I'm done pretending this is normal. Jake, you need to fix this. I looked around the table, at my wife, my kids, Mom, and the various relatives who'd been watching this family drama unfold for years. Then I pulled out my phone and placed it on the table. Funny you should mention fixing things, Marcus. Because I've been wondering about something lately. Sarah, you've been pushing pretty hard for reconciliation over the past few months. What changed? Sarah's face went pale, but she tried to maintain her composure. I just think life's too short for grudges. Is that really it? Or did you find out about Dad's will? The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus's fork clattered to his plate, and I could see the color drain from his face. What will? He asked, but his voice had already changed. The casual confidence was gone, replaced by something that sounded like panic. The one where Dad left everything to me, I said calmly. The one where you get exactly $10. Sarah stood up so fast her chair fell over backwards. That's not possible. We're his family too. He can't just cut you out. I finished for her. The same way you cut him out when you screamed at him for coming to clean up his own property? The same way you threatened to call the police on the man who sold you a house for $70,000 under market value. Marcus found his voice, and it was shaking with rage. You poisoned him against me. You manipulated an old man into changing his will. I laughed, a sound with no humor in it whatsoever. I manipulated him? Marcus, I have 6 months of recordings of you and Sarah trying to manipulate me into softening him up. Want to hear them? I played the first recording. Sarah's voice, artificially sweet and calculating. Maybe you could talk to your dad? Soften him up a little? Help him understand that Marcus just wants his kids to know their grandfather. Then another, Sarah in the kitchen with Mom. Maybe Jake needs to understand what's at stake here. For everyone. And finally, Marcus himself. What happens when Dad dies and we're still not talking? What happens to everything he's worked for? It all just goes to you. With each recording, I watched their faces change. First shock, then anger, then something that looked like genuine panic. This is illegal. Sarah shouted, her composure completely shattered. You can't record people without their consent. One-party consent state, I replied calmly. Completely legal. But what's really interesting is that you're not denying any of it. You're not saying I'm wrong about why you suddenly care about healing the family. Marcus slammed his hand on the table, making the dishes jump. He's our father. We have a right to. To what? To his money. Because that's what this is really about, isn't it? Not the grandchildren you barely let him see before the fight. Not healing the family you've ignored for 8 years. It's about making sure you don't get cut out of the inheritance you feel entitled to. What happened next was even worse than I'd expected. Sarah completely lost control, revealing the entitled, manipulative person she'd always been beneath the sweet exterior. Your father is a bitter old man who's going to die alone and unloved, she screamed, her voice cracking with rage. And you're just like him. Manipulative and cruel, Anne. Sarah. Marcus's voice was quiet, warning, but it was too late. No, Marcus. I'm done pretending. Your family is insane. 8 years of this stupid grudge over what? Over me not wanting my father-in-law to see me naked? Over wanting some privacy in my own home? You didn't just ask for privacy, I said, my voice deadly calm. You screamed at him. You threatened to call the police. You turned a reasonable request into a declaration of war. And then you spent 8 years waiting for him to die so you could cash in on the guilt you created. The room was dead silent except for Sarah's ragged breathing and the sound of Marcus's chair scraping as he stood up. What now? He asked, his voice hollow with defeat. You're going to keep all of Dad's money out of spite. I'm not keeping anything out of spite, I replied. Dad made his choice when you chose your wife's comfort over your father's dignity. When you decided being right was more important than being family. When you let 8 years pass without a single genuine attempt at reconciliation until you thought there was money involved. They left that night in a storm of slammed doors and threats of legal action. Sarah was sobbing, Marcus was raging, and the rest of the family sat in stunned silence. But as I watched them drive away, I felt something unexpected. Relief. The war that had been brewing for months was finally out in the open. The pretense was over. The manipulation was exposed. More importantly, I finally understood what Dad had known all along. Some people love you for who you are, and others love you for what you can give them. 8 years of silence had revealed which category Marcus and Sarah belonged to. The saddest part wasn't that they'd been cut out of the will. It was that they'd cut themselves out of the family long before Dad picked up a pen. True to their nature, Marcus and Sarah hired a lawyer within a week. They contested the will, claiming Dad was mentally incompetent, that I'd manipulated him, that the inheritance was the result of undue influence. Their case painted me as a scheming younger son who'd poisoned an elderly father against his loving older brother. They brought character witnesses, old family friends, even a therapist who'd never met Dad, but was willing to speculate about his mental state based on their description of his behavior. We brought the recordings. Attorney Jennifer Walsh, who'd handled estate disputes for 20 years, listened to every piece of evidence with the patience of someone who'd seen every variation of family greed imaginable. Your Honor, she said during closing arguments, the contestants claim that Mr. Patterson was unduly influenced by his younger son, but the evidence shows exactly the opposite. The contestants' own recorded words demonstrate that their renewed interest in reconciliation coincided perfectly with their discovery, or suspicion, of the will's contents. They approached the younger son not as grieving family members seeking healing, but as strategic actors seeking to soften up the deceased for their own financial benefit. The recordings spoke for themselves. Sarah's voice, caught on tape asking me to soften up Dad. Marcus admitting his concern about what happens to everything Dad's worked for. Their transparent manipulation exposed in their own words. Judge Patricia Hawkins delivered a verdict that still gives me chills. The court finds no evidence of mental incompetence or undue influence on the part of the deceased. Mr. Patterson was clearly of sound mind when he executed his will, and his decision to disinherit his eldest son appears to be based on legitimate grievances stemming from their 8-year estrangement. However, the court finds substantial evidence that the contestants' recent interest in reconciliation was motivated primarily by financial considerations rather than genuine family affection. The recordings submitted into evidence demonstrate a pattern of calculated manipulation that undermines any claim to moral entitlement to the deceased's estate. The will stands as written. Contestants are ordered to pay all court costs. Marcus and Sarah were ordered to pay over $15,000 in legal fees. But more importantly, their true nature was now a matter of public record, documented in court transcripts that would follow them forever. Dad passed away peacefully in his sleep 8 months after the court case, never knowing about the legal battle. In some ways, I'm grateful he was spared the knowledge of just how mercenary his eldest son had become. I inherited everything, exactly as the will specified. The house where I'd grown up, the land that had been in our family for generations, the classic car collection that represented Dad's life's passion. All of it came to me, along with a final letter Dad had written to be delivered after his death. The letter to Marcus was brief but devastating. To my son Marcus, you chose your pride over our relationship. You chose your wife's convenience over your father's dignity. You let 8 years pass without a single word of apology or attempt at reconciliation. This $10 inheritance represents exactly what that choice was worth to me. I hope it was worth it to you. But there was also a letter for me. Jake, you fought your way back from your own mistakes and proved that love is stronger than pride. You showed me that family isn't about blood. It's about who chooses to show up when everything falls apart. Take care of your mother, raise your boys to be better men than we were, and remember that the most valuable inheritance isn't money. It's the lesson that actions have consequences and choices define who we really are. 2 years have passed since Dad's death, and the final acts of this family drama have played out exactly as karmic justice demanded. Marcus and Sarah's marriage didn't survive the stress of the legal battle and financial disappointment. The woman who'd manipulated her way through 8 years of family politics couldn't manipulate her way out of the consequences. Sarah filed for divorce 6 months after Dad's death, taking half of what little they had left after legal fees. She moved back to her mother's house with the kids, and Marcus sees them every other weekend. The woman who'd once screamed at my father for entering her property now lives in someone else's basement, and the man who'd felt entitled to hundreds of thousands of dollars now pays child support on a warehouse supervisor's salary. Sarah remarried last year, coincidentally to a man with money. She posts constantly on social media about her new beginning and her real family, rarely mentioning Marcus or allowing him extra time with his children. The calculating woman who'd orchestrated our family's destruction had simply moved on to her next target. As for me, I kept Dad's house, the one Marcus once said never felt like mine. My wife and I are raising our children there, in the rooms where Dad's grandchildren should have been playing but never got the chance. I sold most of the classic cars but kept Dad's favorite, a 1967 Camaro he'd restored himself. My oldest son learned to drive in that car, the same way I had learned 30 years earlier. Some traditions are worth preserving. The money went into college funds for my kids and a trust for Mom's care. The land became a place where cousins and friends could gather for holidays and barbecues, where laughter fills the spaces that had been silent for too long. But the most satisfying part of this whole story isn't the financial victory, or even the legal vindication. It's the lesson my children learned about the difference between love and manipulation, between family and blood, between earning respect and demanding it. People ask me sometimes if I feel guilty about how things turned out. If I think Dad was too harsh, if maybe I should have tried harder to build bridges instead of exposing betrayals. But I learned something important from those 8 years of watching my father sit in his bedroom, facing the wall while his grandchildren played in the next room. Some wounds are too deep to heal with simple apologies. Some choices have consequences that echo through generations. Marcus could have fixed things at any point. A genuine apology for the way Sarah spoke to Dad, an acknowledgement that they'd handled the situation poorly, even just a phone call on Dad's birthday. Any of those things might have changed the outcome. Instead, they chose to wait until they thought there was money involved. They chose manipulation over reconciliation, calculation over sincerity, greed over grace. The woman who screamed at my father for cleaning his own property is now wealthy again, married to someone else's success. The man who told me I was on my own, when I fought for my relationship with Dad, now knows what it truly means to be alone. But the saddest part of this whole story isn't Marcus's financial loss or Sarah's calculated cruelty. It's that my father died believing his eldest son simply didn't love him enough to say he was sorry. Family isn't about blood. It's about who shows up when everything falls apart, who chooses love over pride, who builds bridges instead of burning them for kindling. Dad's $10 inheritance wasn't an insult, it was a lesson. And sometimes the most expensive education money can't buy is the one that costs you everything you thought you deserved. The old man who could freeze a room with one glance may have been stubborn and unforgiving, but he was also wise enough to know the difference between genuine love and calculated interest. In the end, that wisdom was worth more than all the money he left behind. And now, every time I drive that 1967 Camaro with my son in the passenger seat, I remember that the most valuable inheritance isn't money or property or even family heirlooms. It's the knowledge that your choices define who you are, and that love earned is always worth more than love demanded. The war is over. The real family won. And sometimes that's the only justice that matters.